The Bagman's Dog. Mr. Peters' Story. Richard Harris. Barham. Stantlatory Puppies. Virgil. It was a litter of 5, 4 are drowned and 1 left alive. He was thought worthy alone to survive. And the Bagman resolved upon bringing him up, to eat of his bread, and to drink of his cup. He was such a dear little cock-tailed pup. The Bagman taught him many a trick. He would carry and fetch, and run after a stick, could well understand the word of command, and appear to doze with the crust on his nose, till the Bagman permissively waved his hand, then to throw up and catch it he never would fail, as he sat up on end, on his little cocktail. Never was puppy so beninced root, or possessed of such natural talent as he. And as he grew older, every beholder agreed he grew handsomer, sleeker, and bolder. Time, however, his wheels we may clog, went steadily still with onward jog, and the cock-tailed puppy's a curly-tailed dog. When just at the time, he was reaching his prime, and all thought he'd be turning out something sublime, one unlucky day, how, no one could say, whether some soft liaison induced him to stray, or some kidnapping vagabond coaxed him away, he was lost to the view like the morning dew. He had been, and was not, that's all that they knew. And the Bagman stormed, and the Bagman swore, as never a Bagman had sworn before. But storming or swearing but little avails, to recover lost dogs with great curly tails. In a large paved court, close by Billiter Square, stands a mansion old, but in thorough repair. The only strange thing, from the general air of its size and appearance, is, how it got there. In front is a short semicircular stair of stone steps, some half-score, then you reach the ground floor, with a shell-patterned architrave over the door. It is spacious, and seems to be built on the plan of a gentleman's house in the reign of Queen Anne. Which is odd, for although, as we very well know, under Tudors and Stuarts the city could show many noblemen's seats above bridge and below, yet that fashion soon after induced them to go from St. Michael Cornhill, and St. Mary le Bow, to St. James, and St. George, and St. Anne in Soho. Be this as it may, at the date I assign to my tale, that's about 1769, this mansion, now rather upon the decline, had less dignified owners, belonging in fine, to Turner, Dry, Wiperside, Rogers, and Pine, a respectable house in the Manchester line. There were a score of bagmen and more, who had travelled full off for the firm before. But just at this period they wanted to send some person on whom they could safely depend, a trustworthy body, half agent, half friend, on some mercantile matter as far as Ostend. And the person they pitched on, was Anthony Blogg, a grave steady man not addicted to grog, the bagman, in short, who had lost this great dog. The sea. The sea. The open sea. That is the place where we all wish to be, rolling about on it merrily. So all sing and say, by night and by day, in the boudoir, the street, at the concert, and play, in a sort of coxcomb beacle roundelay. You may roam through the city, transversely or straight, from Whitechapel Turnpike to Cumberland Gate, and every young lady who thrums a guitar, every mustachioed shopman who smokes a cigar, with affected devotion, promulgates his notion, of being a rover and child of the ocean whate'er their age, sex, or condition may be, they all of them long for the wide, wide sea. But, however they dote, only set them afloat in any craft bigger at all than a boat. Take them down to the Nore and you'll see that before the vessel they voyage and has half made her way between Chelness Point and the pier at Herne Bay, let the wind meet the tide in the slightest degree, they'll be all of them heartily sick of the sea. I've stood in Margate, on a bridge of size inferior far to that described by Byron, where palaces and press single quaternions on each hand rise. That too's a stone one, this is made of iron, and little donkey boys your steps environ, each proffering for your choice his tiny hack, vaunting its excellence. And should you hire one, for 6 pence, will he urge, with frequent whack, the much-enduring beast to Buenos Aires and back. And there, on many a raw and gusty day, I've stood and turned my gaze upon the pier, and seen the crews, that did embark so gay that self-same morn, now disembark so queer. Then to myself I've sighed and said, oh dear! Who would believe yon sickly-looking man's a London jack-tar, a cheap Sid buccaneer? But hold my muse. for this terrific stanza is all too stiffly grand for our extravaganza. So now we'll go up, 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 and now we'll go down, 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 and now we'll go backwards and forwards, and now we'll go round, round, round. I hope you've sufficient discernment to see, gentle reader, that here the discarding the D is a fault which you must not attribute to me. Thus my nurse cut it off when, with counterfeit glee, she sung, as she danced me about on her knee, in the year of our Lord 1803. All I mean to say is that the muse is now free from the self-imposed trammels put on by her betters, and no longer like Filch, midst the felons and debtors at Drury Lane, dances her hornpipe in fetters. Resuming her track, at once she goes back, to our hero the Bagman, alas, and Alec. Poor Anthony Blogg is as sick as a dog, spite of sundry unwonted potations of grog, by the time the Dutch packet is fairly at sea, with the sands called the Goodwin's a league on her lee. And now, my good friends, I've a fine opportunity to obfuscate you all by sea terms with impunity, and talking of caulking and quarter-deck walking, fore and aft, and abaft hookers, barkies, and craft, at which Mr. Poole has so wickedly laughed, of binnacles, bilboes, the boom called the spanker, the best bower cable, the jib, and sheet anchor, of lower deck guns, and of broadsides and chases, of taffrails and topsails, and splicing main braces, and shiver my timbers, and other odd phrases employed by old pilots with hard-featured faces. Of the expletives seafaring gentlemen use, the allusions they make to the eyes of their crews, how the sailors too swear, how they cherish their hair, and what very long pigtails a great many wear. But, reader, I scorn it. The fact is, I fear, to be candid, I can't make these matters so clear as Marriott, or Cooper, or Captain Chamier, or Sir E. Lytton Bulwer, who brought up the rear of the Nauticals, just at the end of last year, with a well-written preface, to make it appear that his play, The Sea Captain, is by no means small beer. There. Brought up the rear, you see there's a mistake which not one of the authors I've mentioned would make. I ought to have said, that he sailed in their wake. So I'll merely observe, as the water grew rougher the more my poor hero continued to suffer, till the sailors themselves cried in pity, poor buffer. Still rougher it grew, and still harder it blew, and the thunder kicked up such a hullabaloo, that even the skipper began to look blue, while the crew, who were few, looked very queer too, and seemed not to know what exactly to do, and they who'd the charge of them wrote in the logs, "When Nebraska blows a hurricane, rains cats and dogs." In short, it soon grew to a tempest as rude as that Shakespeare describes near the still-vexed Bermudas. See appendix. When the winds, in their sport, drove aside from its port the king's ship, with the whole Neapolitan court, and swamped it to give the king's son, Ferdinand, a soft moment or two with the Lady Miranda, while her pommet the rest, and severely rebuked him for unhandsomely doing him out of his dukedom. You don't want me, however, to paint you a storm, as so many have done, and in colors so warm? Lord Byron, for instance, in manner facetious, Mr. Ainsworth more gravely, see also Lucretius, a writer who gave me no trifling vexation when a youngster at school on Dean Colette's foundation. Suffice it to say that the whole of that day, and the next, they were scudding away quite out of their course, propelled by the force of those flatulent folks known in classical story as Aquilo, Libs, Notice, Auster, and Boreas, driven quite at their mercy twixt Guernsey and Jersey, till at length they came bump on the rocks and the shallows, in west longitude, 157, near St. Malo's. There you'll not be surprised that the vessel capsized, or that Blogg, who had made, from intestine commotions, his specifical gravity less than the ocean's, should go floating away, midst the surges and spray, like a cork in a gutter, which, swollen by a shower, runs down Holborn Hill about 9 knots an hour. You've seen, I've no doubt, at Bartholomew Fair, gentle reader, that is if you've ever been there, with their hands tied behind them, some 2 or 3 pair of boys round a bucket set up on a chair, skipping, and dipping eyes, nose, chin, and lip in, their faces and hair with the water all dripping, in an anxious attempt to catch hold of a pippin, that bobs up and down in the water whenever they touch it, as mocking the fruitless endeavor. Exactly as poets say, How though they can't tell us, old Nick's nonpareils play at bob with poor Tantalus. Stay, I'm not clear, but I'm rather out here. 'Twas the water itself that slipped from him, I fear. Faith, I can't recollect, and I haven't limper year. No matter, poor Blogg went on ducking and bobbing, sneezing out the salt water, and gulping and sobbing, just as Clarence, in Shakespeare, describes all the qualms he experienced while dreaming they'd drowned him in Mumsy. Oh Lord, he thought, what pain it was to drown. And saw great fishes, with great goggling eyes glaring, as he was bobbing up and down, and looking as they thought him quite a prize, when, as he sank, and all was growing dark, a something seized him with its jaws. A shark? No such thing, reader, most opportunely for Blogg, 't was a very large web-footed curly-tailed dog. I'm not much of a traveler, and really can't boast that I know a great deal of the Brittany coast, but I've often heard say that, and to this day, the people of Granville, St. Malo's, and thereabout are a class that society doesn't much care about, men who gain their subsistence by contraband dealing, and a mode of abstraction strict people call stealing. Notwithstanding all which, they are civil of speech, above all to a stranger who comes within reach. And they were so to Blogg, when the curly-tailed dog at last dragged him out, high and dry on the beach. But we all have been taught by the proverb of old, by no means to think all that glitters is gold. And, in fact, some advance that most people in France join the manners and air of a maître dance, to the morals, as Johnson of Chesterfield said of an elderly lady, in Babylon bred, much addicted to flirting and dressing in red. Be this as it might, it embarrassed Blogg quite to find those about him so very polite. A suspicious observer perhaps might have traced the petite soins, tendered with so much good taste, to the side of an old-fashioned pocket-book, placed in a black leather belt well secured round his waist, and a ring set with diamonds, his finger that graced, so brilliant, no one could have guessed they were paste. The group on the shore consisted of 4. You will wonder perhaps, there were not a few more. But the fact is they've not, in that part of the nation, what Malthus would term, a too dense population. Indeed the sole sign there of man's habitation was merely a single rude hut, in a dingle that led away inland direct from the shingle, its sides clothed with underwood, gloomy and dark, some 200 yards above high water mark. And thither the party, so cordial and hearty, viz. An old man, his wife, and 2 lads make a start, he, the bagman, proceeding, with equal good breeding, to express, in indifferent French, all he feels, the great curly-tailed dog keeping close to his heels. They soon reached the hut, which seemed partly in ruin, all the way bowing, chattering, shrugging, moan-doing, grimacing, and what sailors call parley-vooing. Is it Paris or Kitchener, reader, exhorts you, whenever your stomach's at all out of sorts, to try, if you find richer viands won't stop in it, a basin of good mutton broth with a chop in it. Such a basin and chop as I once heard a witty one call, at the Garrick-a-Dee-Dee committee one. An expression, I own, I do not think a pretty one. However, it's clear that, with sound table beer, such a mess as I speak of is very good cheer. Especially too when a person's wet through, and is hungry, and tired, and don't know what to do. Now just such a mess of delicious hot pottage was smoking away when they entered the cottage, and casting a truly delicious perfume through the whole of an ugly, old, ill-furnished room. Hot, smoking hot, on the fire was a pot well replenished, but really I can't say with what. For, famed as the French always are for ragouts, no creature can tell what they put in their stews, whether bullfrogs, old gloves, or old wigs, or old shoes. Notwithstanding, when offered I rarely refuse, any more than poor Blogg did, when, seeing the reeky repast placed before him, scarce able to speak, he in ecstasy muttered Bejove, cocky leaky. In an instant, as soon as they gave him a spoon, every feeling and faculty bent on the gruel, he no more blamed fortune for treating him cruelly, but fell tooth and nail on the soup and the bouilli. Meanwhile that old man standing by, subducted his long coat-tails on high, with his back to the fire, as if to dry a part of his dress which the watery sky had visited rather inclemently. Blandly he smiled, but still he looked sly, and a something sinister lurked in his eye. Indeed, had you seen him, His maritime dress you'd have owned his appearance was not prepossessing. He'd a dreadnought coat, and heavy sabots with thick wooden soles turned up at the toes, his nether man cast in a striped QUELQUE chose, and a hump on his back, and a great hooked nose, so that 9 out of 10 would be led to suppose that the person before them was Punch in plain clothes. Yet still, as I told you, he smiled on all present, and did all that lay in his power to look pleasant. The old woman too made a mighty ado, helping her guest to a deal of the stew. She fished up the meat, and she helped him to that, she helped him to lean, and she helped him to fat, and it looked like hair but it might have been cat. The little Garants too strove to express their sympathy towards the child of distress with a great deal of juvenile French politeness. But the Bagman bluff continued to stuff of the fat, and the lean, and the tender and tough, till they thought he would never cry hold enough. And the old woman's tones became far less agreeable, sounding like pest, and succor, and diable. I've seen an old saw which is well worth repeating, that says, good eatinch deserveth good drinkinch. You'll find it so printed by Carton or Winkin, and a very good proverb it is to my thinking. Blogg thought so too. As he finished his stew, his ear caught the sound of the word morbleu, pronounced by the old woman under her breath. Now, not knowing what she could mean by blue death, he conceived she referred to a delicate brewing which is almost synonymous, namely blue ruin. So he pursed up his lip to a smile, and with glee, in his cockneyfied accent, responded V, which made her understand he was asking for brandy. So she turned to the cupboard, and, having some handy, produced, rightly deeming he would not object to it, an orbicular bulb with a very long neck to it. In fact, you perceive her mistake was the same as his, each of them reasoning right from wrong premises. And here, by the way, allow me to say, kind reader, you sometimes permit me to straight range the French prove, when they take to aspersing, so inferior to us in the science of cursing, kick a Frenchman downstairs, how absurdly he swears. And how odd 'tis to hear him, when beat through a jelly, roar out in a passion, blue death, and blue belly. To return to our sheep from this little digression, Blogg's features assumed a complacent expression as he emptied his glass, and she gave him a fresh one. Too little he heeded how fast they succeeded. Perhaps you or I might have done, though, as he did. For when once Madame Fortune deals out her hard drops, it's amazing to think how one cottons to drink. At such times, of all things in nature, perhaps, there's not one that's half so seducing as schnapps. Mr. Blogg, beside being uncommonly dry, was, like most other bagmen, remarkably shy, did not like to deny, felt obliged to comply every time that she asked him to wet the other eye. For 'twas worthy remark that she spared not the stoop, though before she had seemed so to grudge him the soup. At length the fumes rose to his brain, and his nose gave hints of a strong disposition to doze, and a yearning to seek horizontal repose. His queer-looking host, who, firm at his post, during all the long meal had continued to toast that garment 'twere rude to do more than allude to, perceived, from his breathing and nodding, the views of his guest were directed to taking a snooze. So he caught up a lamp in his huge dirty paw, with, as Blogg used to tell it, Monsieur, suivez-moi, and marshalled him so the way he should go, upstairs to an attic, large, gloomy, and low, without table or chair, or movable there, save an old-fashioned bedstead, much out of repair, that stood at the end most removed from the stair. With a grain and a shrug the host points to the rug, just as much as to say, there. I think you'll be snug. Puts the light on the floor, walks to the door, makes a formal salaam, and is then seen no more. When, just as the ear lost the sound of his tread, to the bagman's surprise, and, at first, to his dread, the great curly-tailed dog crept from under the bed. It's a very nice thing when a man's in a fright, and thinks matters all wrong, to find matters all right. As, for instance, when going home late-ish at night through a churchyard, and seeing a thing all in white, which, of course, one is led to consider a sprite, to find that the ghost is merely a post, or miller, or chalky-faced donkey at most. Or, when taking a walk as the evenings begin to close, or, as some people call it, draw in, and some undefined form, looming large through the haze, presents itself, right in your path, to your gaze, inducing the dread of a knock on the head, or a severed carotid, to find that, instead of one of those ruffians who murder and fleece men, it's your uncle, or one of the rural policemen. Then the blood flows again through artery and vein. You're delighted with what just before gave you pain. You laugh at your fears, and your friend in the fog meets a welcome as cordial as Anthony Blogg now bestowed on his friend the great curly-tailed dog. For the dog leaped up, and his paws found a place on each side his neck in a canine embrace, and he licked Blogg's hands, and he licked his face, and he waggled his tail as much as to say, "Mr. Blogg, we've foregathered before today." And the bagman saw, as he now sprang up, what beyond all doubt he might have found out before, had he not been so eager to sup. 'Twas Sancho, the dog he had reared from a pup. The dog who when sinking had seized his hair, the dog who had saved, and conducted him there, the dog he had lost out of Billiter Square. It's passing sweet, an absolute treat, when friends, long severed by distance, meet, with what warmth and affection each other they greet. Especially, too, as we very well know, if there seems any chance of a little cadeau, a present from Brighton, or token, to show, in the shape of a work-box, ring, bracelet, or so, that our friends don't forget us, although they may go to Ramsgate, or Rome, or Fernando Po. If some little advantage seems likely to start, from a £50 note to a twopenny tart, it's surprising to see how it softens the heart, and you'll find those whose hopes from the other are strongest, use, in common, endearments the thickest and longest. But it was not so here. For although it is clear, when abroad, and we have not a single friend near, e'en a cur that will love us becomes very dear, and the balance of interest twixt him and the dog of course was inclining to Anthony Blogg, yet he, first of all, ceased to encourage the beast, perhaps thinking enough is as good as a feast. And besides, as we've said, being sleepy and mellow, he grew tired of patting, and crying poor fellow. So his smile by degrees hardened into a frown, and his "that's a good dog" into "down, Sancho, down." But nothing could stop his mute favourite's caressing, who, in fact, seemed resolved to prevent his undressing, using paws, tail, and head, as if he had said, "Most beloved of masters, pray, don't go to bed. You had much better sit up and pat me instead." Nay, at last, when, determined to take some repose, Blogg threw himself down on the outside the clothes, spite of all he could do, the dog jumped up too, and kept him awake with his very cold nose, scratching and whining, and moaning and pining, till Blogg really believed he must have some design in thus breaking his rest. Above all, when at length the dog scratched him off from the bed by sheer strength. Extremely annoyed by the tarnation whop, as it's called in Kentucky, on his head and its opposite, Blogg showed fight. When he saw, by the light of the flickering candle, that had not yet quite burnt down in the socket, though not over bright, certain dark-colored stains, as of blood newly spilt, revealed by the dog's having scratched off the quilt, which hinted a story of horror and guilt. 'Twas no mistake. He was wide awake in an instant. For, when only decently drunk, nothing sobers a man so completely as funk. And hark! What's that? They have got into chat in the kitchen below. What the deuce are they at? There's the ugly old fisherman scolding his wife, and she, dash by the Pope, she's whetting a knife at each twist of her wrist, and her great mutton fist, the edge of the weapon sounds shriller and louder. The fierce kitchen fire had not made Blogg perspire half so much, or a dose of the best James's powder. It ceases all's silent. And now, I declare there's somebody crawls up that rickety stair. The horrid old ruffian comes, cat-like, creeping. He opens the door just sufficient to peep in, and sees, as he fancies, the bagman sleeping. For Blogg, when he'd once ascertained that there was some precious mischief on foot, had resolved to play possum. Down he went, legs and head, flat on the bed, apparently sleeping as sound as the dead. While, though none who looked at him would think such a thing, every nerve in his frame was braced up for a spring. Then, just as the villain crept, stealthily still, in, and you'd not have insured his guest's life for a shilling, as the knife gleamed on high, bright and sharp as a razor, blog, starting upright. Tipped the fellow a facer. Down went man and weapon. Of all sorts of blows, from what Mr. Jackson reports, I suppose there are few that surpass a flush hit on the nose. Now, had I the pen of old Ossian or Homer, though each of these names some pronounce a misnomer, and say the first person was called James Ferson, while, as to the second, they stoutly declare he was no one knows who, and born no one knows where, or had I the quill of Pierce Egan, a writer acknowledged the best theoretical fighter for the last 20 years, by the lively young peers, who, doffing their cornets, collars, and ermines, treat boxers to max, at the luncheon in Jermyn Street. I say, could I borrow these gentlemen's muses, more skilled than my meek one in fibbings and bruises, I'd describe now to you as prime as set to, and regular turn-up, as ever you knew. Not inferior in bottom to what you have read of since Crib, years ago, half knocked Molyneux head off. But my dainty Urania says, such things are shocking. These mittens she loves, detesting the gloves, and turning, with air most disdainfully mocking, from Melpomen's buskin, adopts the silk stocking. So, as far as I can see, I must leave you to fancy the thumps, and the bumps, and the ups and the downs, and the taps, and the slaps, and the raps on the crowns, that pass twixt the husband, wife, bagman, and dog, as blog rolled over them, and they rolled over blog. While what's called the claret flew over the garret, merely stating the fact, as each other they whacked, the dog his old master most gallantly backed, making both the Garcons, who came running in, sheer off, with Hippolyte's single quote thumb, and Alphonse's single quote left ear off. Next, making a stoop on the buffeting group on the floor, rent in tatters the old woman's jupon. Then the old man turned up, and a fresh bite of Sankos tore out the whole seat of his striped calamancos. Really, which way this desperate fray might have ended at last, I'm not able to say, the dog keeping thus the assassins at bay, but a few fresh arrivals decided the day. For bounce went the door, and came half a score of the passengers, sailors, and one or two more who had aided the party in gaining the shore. It's a great many years ago, mine then were few, since I spent a short time in the old Courageux. I think that they say she had been, in her day, a first-rate, but was then what they term a raise, and they took me on board in the Downs, where she lay. Captain Wilkinson held the command, by the way. In her I picked up, on that single occasion, the little I know that concerns navigation, and obtained, inter alia, some vague information of a practice which often, in cases of robbing, was adopted on shipboard. I think 'twas called cobbing. How 'twas managed exactly I really can't say, but I think that a boot jack was brought into play. That is, if I'm right, it exceeds my ability to tell how single quote T is done. But the system is one of which Sanko's exploit would increase the facility. And, from all I could learn, I'd much rather be robbed of the little I have in my purse, than be cobbed. That's mere matter of taste, but the Frenchman was placed, I mean the old scoundrel whose actions we've traced, in such a position, that on this unmasking, his consent was the last thing the men thought of asking. The old woman, too, was obliged to go through, with her boys, the rough discipline used by the crew, who, before they let one of the set see the back of them, cobbed single quote the whole party, every man jack of them. Moral. And now, gentle reader, before that I say farewell for the present, and wish you good day, attend to the moral I draw from my lay. If ever you travel, like Anthony Blogg, be wary of strangers. Don't take too much grog. And don't fall asleep, if you should, like a hog. Above all, carry with you a curly-tailed dog. Lastly, don't act like Blogg, who, I say it with blushing, sold Sanko next month for 2 guineas at Flushing, but still on these words of the bard keep affixed I, Ingridum C. Dixeris, Omnia Dixti. L. Envoy. I felt so disgusted with Blogg, from sheer shame of him, I never once thought to inquire what became of him. If you want to know, reader, the way, I opine, to achieve your design, mind, it's no wish of mine, is, a penny will do single quote T, by addressing the line to Turner, Dry, Wiper Side, Rogers, and Pine.